Alright, welcome back. Today we've got a new story that we're going to be reading. Um, so I'd like to just jump right into it, if you don't mind. So, just relax, get yourself a drink or a snack, because we're going to be reading some fan fiction today. And, you guys deserve a treat. So, the Great Depression. Let's begin. Where the devil are you headed off to? Stewie was standing behind Brian with his arms crossed. It was late, and the dog was decked out in a snazzy suit, making his way toward the door. He knew what that meant, and he didn't like it. Brian turned around to answer the boy. "I've got a date. What's it to you?" Stewie rolled his eyes, doing his best not to reveal just how upset this made him. "Another one? This is the third time this week, Brian. What makes you think this one will turn out any different from the others?" The boy knew he had struck a nerve, and that he was letting his jealousy get the better of him. He couldn't help it, though. Just the thought of Brian hanging around with so many women angered him a great deal. He wanted Brian to be happy, but he wanted even more for Brian to be happy with him. He wasn't surprised when a look of anger spread across the canine's face. "So you're saying that I should just give up any hope of finding love just because I have a bad track record? Well, screw you! I know that there's somebody out there for me, and I'm going to find her one day." Stewie flinched a little at the dog's words. He's going to find her one day. Of course the dog had to emphasize the fact that he would only settle for a woman. Stewie wondered why he even bothered sometimes. Brian wasn't gay, and even if he was, the boy knew his age would be a major problem. There were so many reasons to just give up, but for some reason he just couldn't. He loved Brian too much, and sometimes he hated himself for it. All these thoughts rushed through his head, but his face never revealed his inner turmoil. With a shrug, he responded to the dog's verbal assault. "Hey, take it easy, man. I wasn't saying you should give up. I just think you should take a break is all. All this constant heartbreak can't be good for you, Brian." The dog held his scornful expression for another second before letting it fall away with a sigh. "I'm sorry, kid. I appreciate the concern, I really do. But I'm just in such a dire need to have a connection with someone. I'm literally desperate for love at this point. I just want someone who understands me, you know?" "But I understand you. We can have that connection if you just give me a chance." There was an awkward silence between the two that lasted several seconds before Stewie cleared his throat and spoke up with a timid smile. "Well, you'll always have me." This is how it was, a subtle hint here and there in the hopes that Brian would realize how he truly felt. No matter what happened, he wasn't sure if he would ever get up the nerve to confess his feelings to the mutt. He'd rather have him as a friend than not have him at all. The dog smiled when he noticed the faint blush on the kid's cheeks. He reached down and ruffled the boy's hair. "Thanks, kid. Don't wait up on me. I have a really good feeling about this one." "You have a good feeling about every girl you nail a date with." The child faked a smile and waved as Brian turned to leave the house. He stood in the doorway and watched as Brian got in the car, backed out of the driveway, and drove off. Once the dog was out of sight, he shut the door and shook his head. What happens when his feelings are finally right? A strong sadness began to overwhelm the boy. He couldn't bear the thought of completely losing Brian to another. It just wasn't an option to him. He stood there, lost in his thoughts, until he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around to find his mother hovering over him. "Come on, Stewie, it's time for bed." She knelt down, picked him up, and carried him to his room. Stewie made no attempt to resist, but he knew there would be no sleeping for him tonight unless the dog came home. Brian was currently making his way down the streets of Quahog to meet his date, Susan, at a local restaurant. He and Susan had met at the park about 4 days ago. Brian had taken Stewie there for the afternoon to play, and while he was seated on a bench reading his newspaper, Susan had taken a seat next to him. Being the pretty blonde that she was, Susan immediately caught his eye, and before it was time to leave, he had acquired her phone number. It wasn't until after his horrible date with Christy that he had finally called to see if she'd like to go out. Now here he was, on his way, to the third date he'd had this week. He couldn't blame Stewie for chastising him about it either, but honestly, he was getting desperate. All his life, all he'd ever truly wanted was that one special someone, but for some reason, things never seemed to work out. Over the past couple of months, he'd begun to get more frantic about it too. He wasn't getting any younger, and with each failed attempt at romance, the more and more depressed he became. All this heartbreak was killing him, but he couldn't bring himself to give up. There had to be someone out there for him, right? What would be the purpose of living if he couldn't find happiness? Maybe I'm just destined to be miserable my whole life, he thought. He shook his head. It was thoughts like that that made him consider suicide, and he couldn't keep going down that road. There were people who cared about him, and he wouldn't make them share in his misery. He may have been depressed, but he wasn't, as a friend had put it, selfish. Besides, maybe tonight would go well. There was no reason to always play the pessimist. He forced a smile on his face and turned on the radio. The sound of big band music filled the car, and it helped to alleviate his mood. The morbid thoughts left his mind as he began to sing along, and his fake smile eventually became genuine. He had to think positive for his family's sake, for Stewie. Only a couple more miles left to go, and he just knew that tonight was going to be the night when everything changed. "Good night, honey. Sweet dreams." Lois blew her son one last kiss before cutting off the light and shutting the door. All was silent, but Stewie was far from tired. His mind was too busy worrying about the possibility of Brian's date going well to worry about sleep, so he just stared up at the ceiling. Why did he have to feel this way? And why did it have to be for Brian, the one person he had zero chance with? At first, he had hoped that his feelings would eventually fade away, but instead, they only grew stronger. Nowadays, pretty much all his thoughts were focused on the dog. All his previous goals and desires seemed so insignificant now. All that mattered was having Brian. It was a shame that winning the dog's affections were a task more difficult than taking over the world or killing his mother. It wasn't like Brian didn't care about him. He knew better than that. In fact, he was pretty sure that he was the most important person in the dog's life. As far as he knew, Brian had confided in him things that he had never told anyone, so that had to count for something, right? He looked over at his stuffed companion who was currently lying next to him in his crib. "What do you think, Rupert? Am I just selfish for feeling the way I do about Brian?" There was no verbal response from the bear, but Stewie's imagination gave Rupert the voice the child needed to hear. "You can't help who you fall in love with, Stewie. No, you're not foolish, but I've been trying to tell you that the best thing for you to do is just tell him how much he means to you. Keeping it bottled up is not healthy." The child nodded in understanding. "I wish I could, Rupert, but I just can't. I mean, what if I freak him out, or he wants to stop being friends? What if he never wants to see me again? I don't know what I'd do if that were to happen. A life without Brian would just be empty." He looked back up at the ceiling. The entire situation just seemed so hopeless. "I just feel stuck, and I'm not sure if things will ever get better." His fist clenched as sadness gave way to anger. "Damn it, it's just not fair." He slammed his fist down on the mattress in frustration and looked back over to his bear, begging for a solution. "I don't know what you want me to say, Stewie. It pains me to see you like this. I really wish there was something I could do to make you feel better." The child was so frustrated, but he couldn't help but smile at his friend's concern for him. Rupert had always been there when he needed someone, and right now, he needed to release his pent-up desires. If Brian would give him what he needed, he could always get it from Rupert. His arm reached out to grab the bear by the arm. "I can think of something that might make me feel a little bit better." A lustful glint grew in the boy's eyes as he slowly pulled the bear towards him. In his mind, he could see his partner getting excited as they got closer and closer. "I may not be the one you love, but I'll always be there for you when you need me, Stewie." The child giggled as he thought about how naughty all this was. He pulled the bear on top of him so that it was straddling his waist. The toy in his lap quickly aroused him. "I know, Rupert. I may never have Brian in this way, but at least I'll always have you to help me deal with my frustrations." He pulled the bear down into a strong hug that lasted several seconds before leaning his head forward to press his lips against Rupert's stuffed muzzle. The kiss started off gently, but it quickly became frenzied. Despite there being no response from the bear, Stewie was able to imagine what it would be like if his Rupert were actually living and breathing. He pressed his body harder against the toy and began to grind against it. After a while, that wasn't enough, so he rolled over so that he was on top of Rupert and began to quickly undress himself. Once he was out of his pajamas, he tossed them over to the other side of the crib and smirked down at his bear. "I'm about to take you for the ride of your life, Rupert." He leaned down for one last passionate kiss before removing his diaper and going to town on the stuffed toy. All his worries were forgotten as he was quickly overcome with intense feelings of pleasure. For now, this was enough. Mm-mm. 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 It didn't take long for Brian to arrive at the restaurant. He parked his car, locked it, and entered the building. A reservation had already been made, so he had no trouble getting a table. Susan wasn't here yet, but he wasn't surprised because he was 15 minutes early. He stood in line for a minute before giving his name to the host. Once the host found Brian's name on the list of reservations, he motioned for the dog to follow him as he showed him to the table. After walking to the table, Brian settled into his chair and waited for a waiter to come by and hand him a menu. As he was waiting, he let his eyes wander, taking in the atmosphere of the restaurant. He couldn't help but notice that the place was filled with couples enjoying their meal, smiling at each other, and laughing at one another's corny jokes. He envied them. He'd give anything to have a relationship like that. They looked so happy, he thought. He couldn't remember the last time he had been that happy, or if he had ever been to begin with. His eyes stopped on one particular couple, a man and a woman, who were seated in a booth and snuggled against each other, having finished their meal. It took a while, but eventually they noticed him staring. They both gave him a confused stare back, and it took a couple seconds for Brian to realize the couple had noticed him. He turned away in embarrassment and faked a cough before looking back at them. Sorry, I was just admiring the wallpaper. The wallpaper is really nice here, don't you think? He faked a chuckle in a desperate attempt at alleviating the awkward tension between the three of them. A couple seconds later, the man responded, "Yeah, sure, but whatever you say, buddy." They stared at Brian for a few more seconds before turning to look away, and Brian did the same. He could slap himself right now, but he doubted that an action like that would make him any saner. At that moment, a waiter finally arrived at the table with a menu. The dog practically snatched it out of the waiter's hand before burying his face in it in a pathetic attempt at escaping his current situation. He heard the waiter ask him if he wanted anything to drink and slowly looked up to answer. "No, not at the moment. I'm waiting for someone. She should be here in a minute." The waiter nodded his head and left to tend to another patron. Brian sighed as he closed his menu and placed it on the table. "Come on, Brian, get it together. She hasn't even arrived yet, and you've already found a way to turn this evening into a disaster," he thought. The dog drew in a deep breath to calm himself. The couple he had been staring at earlier passed him to leave, giving him odd looks as they exited out of the door. Brian expelled a sigh of relief. At least he didn't have to worry about those two anymore. After taking a minute to regain his composure, he took out his phone to check and see what time it was. If Susan wasn't late, she would arrive in about 7 minutes. He closed the phone, but kept it in his paw so that he could periodically check back to see the time. A couple more minutes passed, and he looked back at the phone. 4 more minutes. He placed a paw on the table and began to quietly drum his fingers on the table in a show of boredom. After a couple more minutes, he began to hum softly. He looked back at the phone. It was getting really close to the time Susan said she would be here, and he could feel himself getting more nervous by the second. He shook his head in disapproval. When had he become this way? Sure, he had never had the best of luck when it came to women, but he had always been confident. When had he completely lost all hope in his ability to connect with a woman? Was it the compounded effects of rejection after rejection? Had the combination of all his failures finally gotten to him? He didn't understand it. When would things get better for him? Why did it seem like the longer he was alive, the worse things got for him? It was a morbid train of thought, but he couldn't stop thinking about these things. He was so pathetic. What made him think anyone would ever settle for a rotten mutt like him? He thought about all this as he reached a paw up to rub his forehead and looked down to check his phone again. She should have been here by now. A frown formed on his face, but he quickly shook it away. There was no reason to jump to conclusions just yet. She could be stuck in traffic or something. He didn't know what was going on. All he could do was sit and wait, so that's exactly what he did. Second after second ticked by, and minute by minute, Brian began to lose hope. After a while, he grew tired of sitting up, so he leaned back in his chair and looked at the time again. Susan was now 10 minutes late. Where is she? He tried to keep telling himself that there was a good reason Susan was so late, but the longer he sat there, the less convincing that excuse became. Oh, God. The youngest of the Griffins was currently in his room frantically humping his stuffed teddy bear. This wasn't his preferred role when it came to sexual intercourse, but when he was with Rupert, this was the best he could do. It was still wonderful, though. Rupert was the one person he could always count on, and he loved these intimate moments they shared. In fact, he used to harbor some romantic feelings toward the stuffed companion, but that all changed once he realized how much he cared about the family dog. Now they were nothing more than friends with benefits. Rupert knew that Stewie wasn't in love with him, and he was okay with that. He would always be there when Stewie needed someone to be with. The child moaned. He could feel the pleasure building up inside him as his climax grew closer. Oh, Rupert. He began pounding the bear harder. It wouldn't be long now. All he needed was that extra push to send him over the edge. His eyes closed, and an image of Brian flashed before him. It wasn't even what most would consider an erotic image, but it was all Stewie needed to reach his peak. He buried his face in the shoulder of the bear and bit down a little to suppress the scream he let out as he came. A muffled scream escaped from his throat as spasm after spasm of pure bliss coursed through his small body. He continued to hump the bear slowly as he milked every last ounce of pleasure from his orgasm. Slowly, the feelings of rapture died down as Stewie came down from his sex high. The deed left him exhausted, and all he could manage to do was just lie on top of Rupert as he gradually regained his strength. It took a while, but eventually he could move again. The boy rolled off his teddy bear, panting for breath and sweating heavily. He looked over at the bear and smiled. "Thank you, Rupert. I really needed that." He reached his arm over to stroke the toy's side in a show of gratitude. "You're welcome, Stewie, but I'm the one that should be thanking you. Brian doesn't know what he's missing ignoring your advances. He's one lucky dog to have your undying love." Stewie rolled onto his side and gazed confidently at Rupert. I am pretty good in the sack, aren't I?" He laughed. "Brian doesn't realize what he's missing out on. I bet I could pleasure him better than any of those bimbos he wastes his time with. I just wish I could find a way to make him see that." The thought saddened him, but he refused to dwell on it. He was just starting to feel better, and he wasn't going to ruin this moment with his depressing thoughts. He wrapped his arms around the bear, pulled him into a tight embrace, and snuggled himself against it. "I love you, Rupert, and words cannot express how grateful I am to have you as a friend." For several minutes he stayed that way, just enjoying the company of his stuffed companion. He felt so loved right now, and it was a great comfort to him. The boy let out a big yawn as he began to grow tired. Maybe he would be able to rest tonight. Whatever happened with Brian and his date was something he could deal with tomorrow, and maybe, one day, he could make Brian realize how perfect they were for each other. No, he took that back. Not maybe. He would make Brian realize how perfect they were for each other. A huge smile formed on his face as he gave his teddy bear one last kiss on the top of the head. The child reached down for his blanket and pulled it up to cover himself and Rupert. His eyelids grew heavy, and eventually they closed, allowing him to drift off into a relaxed sleep. In his dreams he was with the love of his life, and everything was perfect for the time being. Susan wasn't coming. There was no other explanation for why she was an hour late. Any hope that Brian had left was now crushed. He slammed his phone shut and hung his head. "I should have known better. I'm never going to find anyone because there's nobody out there for me. I'm just some cosmic accident. My existence serves no purpose, and I don't deserve to be with anyone. Even if I were to finally find someone who would put up with me, I'd probably only end up making them miserable too," he thought. He let out a heavy sigh as he placed his phone back in his pocket. He got up from the table, walked to the door, and exited the restaurant. He made his way to the parking lot and shuffled over to his car. He reached into his pocket to retrieve his ring of keys, which had his car key attached to it. After unlocking the car, he got inside and slammed the door shut. Ooh. That stuff packs a kick. Anyway, after unlocking the car, he got inside and slammed the door shut. He threw his head back against the seat and shut his eyes. What now? Should he just go home? Maybe Stewie was still awake, and he could vent his angst to the kid. He shook his head. No, Stewie was probably asleep, and even if the kid wasn't, he'd probably just end up taunting him. He'd mean no harm by it, but that wasn't what he needed to hear right now. What he needed was the comfort of his good friend Jack Daniels. A drink sounded really good right now. With his mind made up, he cranked the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. His next stop was the Drunken Clam, where he could drink all of his sorrows away. As he drove, he allowed his mind to wander. I don't know what I was thinking. Even if Susan had showed up, the evening would have turned into a disaster anyway. It's just time to face the fact that I'm most likely never going to be happy with my life, so what's the point in even going on? I realized that if something were to happen to me, there are people who would be upset, but most of them would probably get over it pretty quickly. The only person who probably wouldn't is Stewie. He's the only reason I haven't ended it all. No matter how terrible things are, I just can't bring myself to hurt him like that. He claims that my life gives him purpose, and I don't even want to think about what would become of him if I weren't around anymore. Peter and Lois already screwed up both Chris and Meg. I won't let them do that to Stewie. He needs me, but a part of me wishes that he didn't. What a relief that would be. I could just kill myself already and escape this hellhole I call a life. I don't care if it's considered the coward's way out. It's the only thought that brings me any comfort, and under different circumstances I would take it in an instant, he thought. With that thought, he pulled up to the Drunken Clam and parked his car. He got out, walked in, and took a seat at the bar. The bartender, Horace, noticed him and walked over. "What'll it be, Brian? The usual?" The dog nodded his head. "Yeah, make sure to keep them coming, too." Horace motioned okay and made quick work in preparing Brian's drink. He placed the glass in front of Brian, and the dog reached over to pick it up. He took a moment to admire the liquid in his glass. There was nothing like a glass of Jack Daniels to bring him comfort when he was feeling down. He gave the glass a delicate swirl before he raised it to his lips and gulped the beverage down. A half-hearted smile grew on his face as he savored the taste and the warm feelings that came with it. After making sure he swallowed every drop, he slammed the glass down on the table. Almost immediately, Horace set another one down for him. Brian reached for the new glass and took a moment to admire the liquid inside of it before taking a sip. It was a small comfort, and for him, those were getting harder and harder to find. "Brian, I'm home." Stewie Griffin entered his home and shut the door. After hanging up his keys, he walked over to the couch and sat down. He was exhausted. It had been a long day, and he could use the company of his partner right now. He waited, but no answer came. Growing impatient, he shouted again, this time louder than before. "Brian, the love of your life is home from a hard day at work and would really appreciate it if you'd come down and spend some time with him." Not too much later, Stewie could hear the sound of footsteps rushing down the stairs. Brian emerged from the stairwell and went to join his companion on the couch. He turned and looked at Stewie, giving him a look of confusion. "You're a little early, aren't you? I thought you said you wouldn't be back until 5. It's only 4. Stewie gave Brian a look of disapproval. This wasn't how he was expecting to be treated. "They had a problem on the racetrack, so I wasn't able to do my final test drive. Hopefully it won't affect my chances of winning too badly. But what's it matter that I'm home a little early? Aren't you happy to see me?" The dog smiled and leaned in to give Stewie a kiss. It was just a peck, but when he pulled away, Stewie was practically beaming in delight. "Of course I'm happy to see you." He wrapped an arm around his partner and pulled him in so that they cuddled against each other. Stewie wrapped his arms around the dog and rested his head on Brian's shoulder. Brian placed his head on top of Stewie's. "I was just curious. I wasn't expecting you to be back this early." Stewie smirked. "What's the matter? Were you doing something you didn't want me to see?" The dog gave a nervous laugh, but lucky for him, Stewie didn't notice it. "What could I possibly be doing that I wouldn't want you to see? After all the crazy shit we've done, I think we're long past having to worry about embarrassment." Stewie pulled his head out from under Brian's and looked the dog in the eyes mischievously. "You mean like the time when—" He leaned in to whisper into the dog's ear. Brian's eyes got wide as Stewie proceeded to recount to him a particularly lewd tale involving one of their many sexual exploits. Once he was done, Stewie pulled away and gazed lustfully at his companion. Brian began scratching the back of his neck as he nervously chuckled. "Yeah, like that. That was something." He looked away from Stewie. The dog didn't like the look he was giving him. He could tell that Stewie wanted him right now, but he just wasn't in the mood. Stewie noticed the strange way in which Brian was acting and put a hand on his shoulder. "What's the matter, Bri?" Brian forced a smile onto his face and turned back to answer Stewie. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just not really in the mood for anything right now, and I can tell what you're thinking just by looking at you." Stewie scoffed at this and folded his arms. "You know, you can just tell me these things, Brian. I would have figured that, after how long we've been together, you would know that I would never force you into anything you were uncomfortable with." His face softened as he reached over to stroke the dog's cheek. "I love you, Brian, and I would never do anything to risk losing you." The dog reached his paw to grab Stewie's hand. I love you too, Stewie." For a moment they just stared at each other. Stewie was lost in Brian's gaze. He could stare at those eyes forever. After a while, though, he forced himself to look away and stood up from the couch. Brian grabbed his arm lightly and Stewie looked back at him. "Where are you going?" Stewie pulled his arm free and rubbed it a little. I'm going up to our room to change. I need to get out of this uniform." Brian sat up from the couch. "I have a better idea. Why don't you go get yourself something to eat and I'll go and get you something else to wear?" Stewie looked at Brian extremely puzzled. "Wouldn't it make more sense for me to go find something to wear and you to make me something to eat?" Brian began rubbing the back of his neck again. "Well, yeah, I guess, but I was thinking that, maybe—" Stewie cut Brian off. "I'm exhausted, Brian. I just want to get out of this uniform, and I'm sorry, but I don't have the patience for this." He began walking away, but Brian grabbed his arm again. This time, his grip was even tighter. It hurt a little. Stewie looked at Brian angrily. "What the devil do you think you're doing? Let go of me." He tried to pull his arm free, but the dog's hold was too strong. What's the meaning of this, Brian? The dog looked distant. It was as if he wished he were anywhere at this moment but here. Stewie continued to pull. I can't let you go up there. At this, Stewie stopped struggling and glared at Brian. Why not? What are you hiding up there? The dog looked down, but Stewie could see the guilt written all over his face. He gritted his teeth. Let go of me, Brian. After a moment, the dog finally gave up and let go. Stewie continued walking toward the staircase, only this time it was more like a jog. He got to the stairs and proceeded up them. He could hear Brian following slowly behind him. Stewie reached the top of the stairs and slowly ran to his and Brian's bedroom door. He reached for the knob and was about to turn it, but he stopped for a second. He didn't know what he would find behind this door, but if Brian's attitude was any indication, he knew that he wasn't going to like it. He took a deep breath and turned the knob slowly. He could hear the dog coming up behind him as he pushed the door open. I'm sorry. There, in their bed, lay a woman. Stewie just stared at her for a moment. She looked terrified, and she had every right to be. All kinds of emotions rushed through Stewie, but the one he felt the strongest was pure unbridled anger. Who the fuck are you? The woman said nothing. She just continued to look pathetic and frightened, like a scared mouse cornered by a cat. Stewie felt a paw being gently placed on top of his shoulder. I didn't want it to end this way. Stewie could feel tears brimming in his eyes. He violently shrugged away from Brian's paw and turned to face him. How could you do this, Brian? I thought you loved me. Brian was frowning as he shook his head. That's the thing, Stewie. I do love you. It's just not a romantic love, though. The tears were falling now. Stewie clenched his fists in frustration. What are you talking about? What about all the time we've spent together? Was that a lie? The dog sighed. I care about you, Stewie, I really do. And I tried to make it work because I wanted you to be happy. But I'm just not attracted to you. No matter how much I try and throw myself into this relationship, I just can't feel for you the way you feel for me. So I guess the answer is, yes, it was a lie. I never meant for it to be, but that's all it ever was. At those words, Stewie placed his face in his hands and burst into sobs. He didn't know what he should do. All he was capable of at this moment was weeping. Neither Brian nor the woman made a sound. The only noises in the entire house were Stewie's cries of sorrow. After what seemed like several minutes, he felt a pair of arms wrapping themselves around his torso. He looked up to see that it was Brian, and he roughly pulled away from the embrace. He wiped his tears on his sleeve. You think a fucking hug is gonna make everything better? Brian placed his arms by his sides and let his eyes wander in an attempt to avoid eye contact. Stewie laughed darkly. I should have known that this would happen. You finally get into a relationship with someone who loves you unconditionally, and you'd have to just go and throw it all away because you can't get over the fact that he has a dick. Well, fuck you, Brian. I hope she was goddamn worth it. Stewie marched forward and pushed his way past Brian. The dog made no attempt to stop him as he made his way down the stairs and out of the house. He knew he shouldn't have to be surprised by this turn of events. This is what he got for actually thinking Brian would settle for him. He raised his head up towards the sky and let out an infuriated scream in a desperate attempt to release all of the emotions building up inside of him. Ah! Like that. Okay, break. We're gonna break there. I hope you... Okay, that was pretty shocking. I hope you enjoyed that Family Guy story. We'll be back with more, though, definitely. So be peeled for that. And we'll just have a farewell drink. So I hope this helped brighten up your day. Because it brightened up mine significantly. So yeah, stay frosty.